No, go for it. I think we should, yeah, do it.
Okay, great. Good morning, everybody. My name is Mark Van Kerkhoff, and this is the Land Use and Housing Committee for CMAP for our meeting today. I've got a couple of housekeeping things I need to cover. This is in quotes, so I'm not making this up. As permitted by the Governor's Declaration of August 21st, 2020, the determination has been made that an in-person meeting is not practical or prudent for this committee to meet in person. To ensure a transparent and open meeting as possible, we will post the meeting materials approximately 1 week in advance. We'll be providing a recording of this meeting linked in our website, and we'll take all votes by roll call. Just a couple other reminders. Please stay muted when not talking. Unmute yourself at any point if you want to contribute to the conversation. Keep your video on if you're comfortable doing so. It's nice to see your faces. But if you're not, that's certainly fine also. You can also use the chat feature to pose any questions that you might have. Matt and Michelle are doing a great job monitoring that, and will let us know if someone's entered something in chat. And then for our guests and general public, please stay muted until the public comment section at the end of the meeting. We are very happy that you could join us this morning, though. So with that, we will, do we have any agenda changes or announcements?
No, none.
Okay, now we are going to do our approval of minutes. As I mentioned, we do have to do a roll call vote. We will also use this first roll call to confirm attendance, which will save us a little bit of time. Committee members do not need to abstain from approving minutes from a previous meeting that you did not previously attend. So we need 13 members as a quorum to vote. So just by gauging the number of tiles on my gallery view, I think we have at least 13. So Matt, are you going to be doing the roll call vote for the agenda? I guess first I need a motion and a second, and then if there's any changes or questions. So if I could have a motion. Okay, that was Heather, and second by
Angela.
Okay, thank you. You got that, Matt?
Yep.
Okay. So any changes or questions on the meeting minutes? Hearing none, we'll go ahead and do a roll call vote.
All right. Matthew Asselmeyer or anyone from Kendall County? Drew Awesome?
Yes.
Hey, Drew. Adam Ballard?
Yes.
Alan Banks? Angela Brooks?
Yes.
Susan Campbell, or let's see, we've got a little bit of noise on the line if folks could just check their mute. Susan Campbell or anyone from Cook County Planning?
Sylvia Parham here from Cook County.
Thanks, Sylvia. Would you, are you, just to be formal about this, are you voting to approve the minutes from the last meeting?
I'm just formal right now.
Lisa DeChiara?
Yes, aye. Lisa DeChiara.
Thanks, sorry about that. Mackenzie Drozdy?
Here and approved.
Thank you. David DuBois?
Present and yes.
Thank you. Ben Fenton?
Yeah, I'm here and approved. I'm having a little trouble logging into the GoTo meeting, so I'm calling in for right now.
Great, thank you. Nancy Furfer?
Yes, I'm here and I do approve.
Veronica Gonzalez. Paul Haas, or someone from DuPage County Planning.
Present.
Thank you.
And
Paul.
aye.
Thank you. Christine Kolb. Steve Manella, or an alternate from Metro.
Yes, I'm here. This is Stephen, and I approve.
Thank you, Steve. Heather Mullins.
Yes.
Thanks, Heather. Good morning. Arnold Randall. Caitlin Ritter. Thank you. Dennis Sandquist.
Hans Bacchus.
Thanks, Hans. Kyle Smith, I believe, is absent this morning due to a child care coverage issue. Bob Tucker.
Here and approved.
Thank you. Mark.
Yes, here and approved.
Eric Wagner, or an alternate from Lake County Planning. And Miriam Zook.
Lake County's here.
Oh, thank you. Was that Tom?
Yes.
Great, thank you. And Miriam.
Here and approved.
Thank you. All right, the item passes. Thank you.
Great.
Back to you,
Thank
Mark.
you very much. Thanks for your patience in going through the roll call. And the next item is actually pretty exciting. We have a new liaison to our committee, Dominic, and I see he's on the call, and I see his smiling face. Welcome, Dominic, and maybe you could tell the committee a little bit about yourself.
Thank you very much. I do appreciate it. The warm introduction. I'm a planner here at CMAP. I've been a planner with CMAP for about a year, but I bring 20 years of planning experience to my role. I've worked on both coasts with the city of San Francisco and some consulting firms in Washington, D.C. For about the first 8 years, previous 8 years, I worked locally as a zoning administrator with Morton Grove and a zoning planner with the village of Evanston. So I'm very excited, look forward to working with the committee. Matt has been tremendous and I appreciate all his work. Right now, if you see my head going back and forth, that's because I have a 6-year-old to the left of me and a 9-year-old to the right of me doing PE, and we're trying to distract 2 dogs. So I'm not sure how much help I've been to Matt over this last week or so, but I hopefully we'll be able to contribute as we go forward. So thank you very much for the committee, and I look forward to working with all of you. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Dominic. And I think a lot of folks can sympathize with what young parents are going through right now with kids at home and remote learning and being cooped up for this extended period. So, but welcome, and we look forward to your support for our committee's work. Next, we are going to cover the unequal census response in the CMAP region. So, Matt, I'll let you go ahead and introduce our presenter for that.
Great, thanks everyone. A quick note about the agenda today. There's only this first presentation is going to be the one presentation from CMAP staff today. We're really excited that the additional agenda items are from committee members. I'm excited to sort of meet that need and desire that committee members have expressed over the last year to also have this committee be an opportunity to share resources and best practices amongst committee members and have CMAP gain the benefits of being able to be a part of that exchange and hearing that exchange. But before we jump into that, I want to turn it over to my colleague, Timmy Coello, who has been doing an immense amount of work over the last month, leading some analysis into census response rates in the region. Timmy, I will share your presentation now.
Yeah, thanks, Matt, for that introduction and for inviting me to talk about this important topic. So as Matt said, I'm a policy analyst here at CMAP, and myself, along with a number of colleagues, have been working on doing a regional analysis of census self-response trends to better explain what's happening in the region. So the next slide is going to just show some of the key findings, but before I get into it, I wanted to just emphasize that we know likely many members have been reading the news about the census and its importance and are aware of some of the trends in self-response rates, but this CMAP analysis really is aiming to provide more data to ground those conversations and hopefully to help in the last month of census outreach, so that this data that we bring to bear can be useful. So in terms of the key findings, the analysis illustrated that communities of color are filling out the census at much lower rates than majority white communities, that the Hispanic community in Chicago, as well as the suburbs, has seen the largest decline in self-response rates when compared to the 2010 census, and that CMAP made an estimate of the impact of a 5% reduction in Illinois' population count and how that would have impacted the CARES Act allocation the state received for COVID-19 relief. And if that 5% reduction had taken place, the state would have lost out on $235.5 million of pandemic relief funding. And we'll be talking more in depth about some of these statistics as we go throughout the presentation. So the next slide is just giving a grounding on the trends in self-response rates across the region. And a definitional note is that census self-response is both the responses that the individual submits via mail or online for the census. And the data that is being shown is from August 19th, so somewhat slightly out of date, but the general trends are very much still in line. So what we see is that on a regional standpoint, the average self-response rates are slightly below what they were at the end of 2010. However, there are significant disparities by geography and by the demographics of the communities in the region. Each of the 7 counties in the region, it has some areas that are experiencing below average self-response rates, which really illustrates the joint challenge that this is. It's not only in one area. And as you can see on the map, there are areas that have self-response rates that are 40% and lower, which will further unpack some of the trends that seem to be driving that. This next slide breaks down the self-response rates by the demographics it tracks. And a main takeaway as I previewed is that the majority tracks with the majority residents of color have had a much lower response rate when compared to 2010. So looking through this bar chart, you're seeing both the absolute rates as they are about a week and a half ago in 2020 of the 2020 census, as well as the 2010 rates in the darker grayish blue as a benchmark. So as you can see here, the majority white census tracts are roughly in line with their 2010 rates, and some recent data pulled even showed they might be on track to exceed 2010. However, for the majority communities of color census tracts, there are more serious declines relative to 2010. And specifically the Hispanic or Latino tracts, but we use the term Hispanic given the census designation in the data. Majority Hispanic tracts have seen the largest decline in census self-response compared to 2010, and majority Hispanic, or I should say majority Asian and Black census tracts have seen smaller but still concerning declines of 2 to 3 percentage points. And this is again compared to the Chicago area regional average that is roughly 69% self-response rate. This next slide goes further into the geography of Hispanic self-response rates. So the map on the right indicates the darker gray areas that are colored in. Those are majority Hispanic census tracts, and the red diagonal hashes are census tracts that have self-response rates of 10 percentage points or lower when compared to the final 2010 self-response rates. And as you can see, there's a good deal of overlap between those two areas, which culminates in the majority of Hispanic census tracts have, on average, have a more than 7 percentage point drop. And in terms of what might be driving this disproportionate drop that is being experienced in majority Hispanic census tracts, it's likely the case based off of news reporting and the feedback of on-the-ground folks is that the unsuccessful efforts by the federal administration to include a census question in the 2020 census is likely one cause of a depressed response rates to the census, but also the COVID-19 and the resulting both economic and health crises that we're still facing. These areas are also disproportionately home to essential workers, which is also a potential cause. That additional burden is also a potential cause for a reduced prevalence of census response. So that's just quickly going through some of the regional trends. So we also wanted to put this in context of major metro areas across the country. And broadly speaking, the Chicago trends I said are in line with what we're seeing across the country. In 16 of the 20 largest metro areas in the country, census self-response rates have fallen for the 2020 census as compared to the 2010 census. And the lower self-response rates seem to be disproportionately being driven by majority Hispanic areas within those regions. The next slide just zooms in and highlights the Chicago region. And as you can see, we're roughly in the middle of the pack, while there are some peers that are doing better than, say, Philadelphia, Boston, and New York City. There are other regions that we are underperforming relative to, such as Detroit and Washington, D.C. And as I said, that it's important to note that this trend in depressed Hispanic self-response is fairly indicative across the country. So the next slide kind of shifts from a report out of the trends in self-response to talking about the importance of the census. We all know that it's very crucial for political representation in Congress and a number of other factors. But the truth is that the census is also critical to distribute more than $675 billion in federal funding every year. And in addition to the variety of programs that we all may have heard that the census is involved in distributing the funds for, CMAP, we undertook a modeled scenario that I previewed earlier with the CARES Act, just to try to make this a bit more concrete based off a recent high-profile program. The CARES Act, which was passed earlier this spring, had a provision in it that provided states and local governments with aid for any COVID-19 related expenditures they undertook. And effectively one of the major criteria that was used to distribute that money was state population as defined by the 2019 Census Bureau population estimate. So using that number, we modeled what a severe undercount might have done in terms of the state's resources to handle the COVID-19 pandemic. If the state's population, as I mentioned earlier, had been 5% less, we would have lost out on $235.5 million in pandemic funding. And to put it another way, for every person the state hadn't counted, that would have been a loss of $371. And the real takeaway of this, which is I'm sure also familiar to the folks on this call, is just because a local government has an uncounted population doesn't mean that those people no longer need to be supported. Instead, it just means that there's fewer resources to do so. And I also want to just briefly note that this can have a disproportionate impact in disinvested communities that have been starved of resources for a number of decades. In those areas, there's already a difficulty in attracting grocery stores, pharmacies, and retail. And we know that the census is used to make critical business as well as other resource allocation decisions. And the communities of color that are disproportionately facing disinvestment would be facing potentially biased decision making for a decade if an undercount is not avoided. So the next slide, as we're wrapping up, just previews a social media toolkit that CMAP included in this analysis. This presentation is built upon a policy brief, which goes into greater detail, and that is available on the CMAP website. And within that policy brief is a social media toolkit that our communications department created. As you can see on the screen, there are sample tweets, newsletter blurbs, as well as LinkedIn posts that we highly encourage you to utilize so that you can easily share the message of a census undercount or the risk of a census undercount with your network. And we hope that this is one way that as a region we can join forces to make sure that we finish strong, given that the census is wrapping up at the end of September, which is 1 month earlier than originally planned by the Census Bureau, which just further increases the urgency of the moment. So that is my presentation. As I said in the next slide, just if you would like any more details, please look on our website for the analysis, as well as look at that toolkit. And I'm happy to respond to any questions via the contact information I just put on the screen. But that's all for today, and thank you, Matt, for inviting me to present on this work.
Great, thank you very much for that great analysis. I'll be sharing that with our Complete Count committee. I encourage anyone else who's involved in your communities or have connections to any of the Complete Count efforts to share this information out. It certainly is motivating to redouble our efforts to get people counted. But great analysis, and thank you very much. Do we have any questions from the committee?
I'm curious to know whether or not you've been able to figure out the lack of being able to go door to door as they have in the past has had an impact, particularly on some of the populations that haven't been participating as much.
So I think that is certainly a concern. I was presenting on this analysis yesterday at the Metropolitan Mayor's Caucus peer advisory group, and certainly concerns about the type of follow-up that they have not been able to do or raise. So while we weren't able to really unpack that in that analysis, but that's certainly a concern that I think has been raised, and that outreach folks are persevering to try to remedy.
Great, thank you. In the interest of time, since we have a pretty packed agenda, please send any other questions you have directly to Timmy or to Matt. And thank you very much for the great presentation. With that, we'll move on to the next agenda item, the APA Illinois Housing Policy Guide.
All right, and for that, I will introduce Angela Brooks, our own longstanding committee member, to present on this, and I'll be sharing my screen again for this. Angela, we can't, or at least I can't yet hear you. Might be having, am I correct that we can't hear Angela right now? All right, we may be maybe having some technical issues there.
Should we move on to the next agenda item and come back after? Oh.
Yeah. Miriam, are you able to jump in here?
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Now we can, yes.
Okay. Okay, let me see if I can share my screen. Let's see. Try this again.
So as Miriam's pulling up her screen, just to be clear here, we're jumping up to agenda item 7.0. And our presenter is Miriam Zook from Enterprise Community Partners, also a community member. Thanks, Miriam.
Sure. And just to confirm, you can see my screen and you can hear me.
Yes, and yes.
Thank you very much.
Okay, good. Well, Matt, let me know. I'm, technical difficulties. If I freeze or anything, just flag me. My voice proudly. So thank you, Matt, and the co-chairs for giving me the opportunity to present to you today. My name is Miriam Zook. I am Senior Program Director at Enterprise Community Partners. And I'm going to be sharing with you two efforts that Enterprise has been involved in to advance racial equity through housing policy and planning. As you all probably know, housing and land use sectors have historically not been champions of racial equity, and really instead have served to establish and reinforce our patterns of segregation and inequality along race and class lines in our region and really across the country. So I'm proud to be presenting on two really bold efforts to reverse those trends here in Chicago area. First, the Cook County Assessment of Fair Housing. And I'm also going to be giving a brief overview of a new effort that the Department of Housing in the city of Chicago is doing that we are supporting on, that is a racial equity impact assessment of their qualified allocation plan. Okay, so here is a brief overview of what I'm going to be covering. I know we're a pretty diverse group, so I'm going to be spending a little bit of time on the context of fair housing first. And then I'll go into detail on those two plans that I mentioned. So I'm sure you are all really well aware that our segregated region did not occur organically. It was not fueled only by individual household preferences, but really is the direct result of historic government-sponsored policies and programs that intended to keep people separate by race and ethnicity. I'm going to give a slide. The next slide has a long list of them, but if you are not familiar with our long history of this, I would definitely point you to the Color of Law book that goes into really good documentation of this. Due to the intentional public policy decisions, and as reflected in this quote here, we have really set predominantly Black and Brown communities at a disadvantage, making upward mobility virtually impossible. And what's behind the fair housing movement is what we have here in this third bullet, is this assertion that what has been done through intentional policies and practices can only be remedied through intentional policies and practices, right? We can't just remove the laws that restricted where people can live, but we really need to make bold intentional efforts towards desegregation and equity. So again, I put in a kind of high level of some of the policies and practices that have stripped opportunity and wealth from communities of color here. I'm not going to go into these in any detail. I just wanted to have them here as a reference. But these have really maintained the color lines in our society. And while many of them are no longer law, they're the foundation on which our region has been built. And so the Fair Housing Act was a really direct response to our racist history of housing policy and came on the heels of social upheaval that took place in the 1960s, a history that feels really present today. I think it's important to remember that the Fair Housing Act that was part of the Civil Rights Act was passed only 7 days after the assassination of Martin Luther King in 1968. And it laid out two main goals. The first one was to eliminate discrimination in the housing market and by establishing protected classes and a legal system to ban discrimination. Here are the protected classes that are part of the Fair Housing Act, and we have many more here in Cook County. But it also established the need to actively dismantle our segregated society by affirmatively furthering fair housing. So in it said that, you know, HUD had to do more than just simply not discriminate itself, and it really needed to advance fair housing through its programs and grants. Unfortunately, very little was done to advance that second goal up until the Obama administration, which in 2015 released the Affirmatively Furthering Fair Housing Rule. It was announced here in Chicago. Maybe some of you were at that announcement. And the rule really provided clarity and accountability with clear requirements for jurisdictions to conduct and implement assessments of fair housing. I would argue that it brought really 21st century planning tools and techniques to fair housing, creating a comprehensive approach to both inventorying the patterns of segregation and inequality, understanding their root causes, and setting goals and strategies to take meaningful actions, while at the same time engaging community and fostering collaboration, as you can see here in this graphic on the right-hand side. So I'm sure you all know that there have been major federal setbacks around this rule. And here you can see our president governing by tweet on the right-hand side, effectively saying that they're eliminating this rule. My understanding right now is that everybody's kind of in a wait and see moment, see what happens from the elections or seeing if this actually gets taken to court. So I would be remiss to say, you know, everything is well and good in fair housing and with the this rule, but we do have commitments here, and I think everybody that is working on this assessment of fair housing understands the importance and wants to see it through. So despite these federal setbacks, I would argue that the importance of fair housing is just as important today, if not more, than it was when the Fair Housing Act was enacted in the 1960s. And while many of the explicitly racist practices that kept Black and brown households out of white communities are a thing of the past, we continue to be scarred by their legacy and have really adopted policies and practices that reinforce these patterns. So you've likely seen this race map of Cook County that shows how highly segregated it is. We're one of the most segregated regions in the country. And here, you probably can't see it in any detail, but in pink represents white households, blue represents Black households, and orange represents Hispanic households. And what I think is significant about this is the way that, because of the way communities tend to hoard resources, these racial boundaries overlap with place-based opportunities like employment, transportation, education, health, and safety. So I've highlighted here a couple of current practices that serve to really reinforce segregation and inequality in our region that span the gamut of actors, from local governments that maintain restrictive exclusionary zoning to banks and investors that maintain disinvested neighborhoods. One of the benefits of the assessment of fair housing is that it really does this comprehensive inventory. It's the first time I've seen this anywhere, where you are really going through all of the causes and really taking a thorough inventory of what's going on, what's causing these patterns of segregation, to paint the full picture of the drivers of segregation and inequality in our housing system. So I would say that the current pandemic and summer of civil unrest make fair housing even more important today than ever before. You've likely seen the data about the disparate COVID-19 outcomes and how it's disproportionately impacting communities of color. Here in Chicago, Latinx residents are over 3.5 times more likely to get COVID-19 than white, and Black residents are more than 2.6 times more likely to die from COVID-19 than white population in Chicago. And housing and land use play a really important role in this patterning. Here are I just bulleted a couple of the ways that housing and land use can both influence the heightened exposure of communities of color to contract COVID-19, as well as increase their vulnerability to it. And down at the bottom, I think, if the Great Recession has anything to teach us, we are all expecting the impending foreclosure and eviction crisis to really disproportionately impact communities of color and further reinforce these cycles of inequality. We've also started hearing about the ways that, the civil unrest right now is also linked to our inequitable housing and land use system, right? Probably some of you saw the blog post by Chicago Region's very own Gail Schechter that she wrote about earlier this summer, and I thought that this recent Shelter Force article really laid out the ways in which segregation and inequality in housing play into over-policing and police violence. I also included here a great resource if you haven't visited the Furman Center over at NYU. They have a whole series of discussions about segregation and policing that I think are really help highlight some of these patterns. So given this backdrop, hopefully I've convinced you that fair housing is important, and if not, please reach out to me. But I'm going to give a brief overview of the assessment of fair housing process and its status now. So the assessment of fair housing is the first of its kind that I know of collaboration in this region between 18 participating jurisdictions and public housing authorities. It was launched last spring. And despite all the federal setbacks and the global pandemic, I would say we are on track to be finalizing it this fall. We have gotten commitments from the participating jurisdictions that they are committed to finishing this assessment because they too realize the importance of fair housing at this time. And so here you can see a list of all the participating jurisdictions and public housing authorities, as well as who comprises the project team at the bottom. Credit really must be given to the Chicago Area Fair Housing Alliance has done a really robust community engagement approach for this. So the 18 participating jurisdictions and the housing authorities pooled their funding to support a sustained community engagement throughout the timeline. And we provided community convener grants, which were administered by CAFA, to 8 frontline service providers and community organizers that conducted community engagement with stakeholders, really with the goal of outreaching and getting input from people that are most impacted by housing policies and practices. We also created an advisory committee that had both these community convener grant recipients, they are bolded here, as well as a bunch of local advocates and subject matter experts that really help the project team and the participating jurisdictions, it's a mouthful, in scoping the assessment of fair housing, interpreting data, identifying goals and strategies. And this committee has also had an opportunity to work really directly in collaboration with the jurisdictions and housing authorities to really advance the goals of the assessment. So what started out as an 18-month planning process is now closer to, I would say, 24 months, mainly because of the pandemic, but because of obviously many of the other setbacks that we've seen. But I've highlighted here where we're at the end, in where we're finalizing the goals and strategies with each of the jurisdictions and housing authorities, and working with them to tailor them, to make them actionable, to make them meaningful, making sure that this is an assessment, this isn't like a plan that you put on the shelf. This is something that where jurisdictions really take action from. And you can see here on the slide, we've established 8 broad overarching goals by the project team and advisory committee that each of the jurisdictions and housing authorities are reviewing and adapting to their local needs. And then the shared ones are going to be the region-wide ones, and then each of the sub-regions are going to have their specific goals and strategies. What you don't see here are these really in-depth action-oriented strategies that correspond to each of these goals. But we are, as I said, we are vetting these with each of the participating jurisdictions, and we're making sure that they are actionable and timely, and really advance fair housing in the region. So there is a ton more work to be done, but we are very committed to this. We think it's very important, and we think that there's a lot to learn, I would say, for the region that they can draw on for advancing fair housing in their communities that are outside of Cook County. So now I'm going to shift gears slightly. I say slightly because it's kind of similar, related, but it's much more specific. So this is not an overarching inventory of all the different policies and processes that, but rather really a drill down on one specific one. And so we've been supporting the city's Department of Housing in conducting a racial equity assessment of their qualified allocation plan. That you all probably well know is the plan that guides the allocation of the low-income housing tax credit, which is the largest funding source for affordable housing. So this is yet another planning tool that was developed by the Government Alliance for Race and Equity and adapted for local context by the Chicago United for Equity organization. And the REIA, the Racial Equity Impact Assessment, aims to really weigh who benefits and who is burdened by specific policies and practices. So it really drills down on different racial and ethnic groups and how they may differentially be impacted by policies and practices, with the goals of asking different questions, engaging different voices, and exploring different solutions. So really the opposite of business as usual. Here are the high-level outcomes that are desired outcomes of the REIA, of really getting community stakeholders more informed and engaged and better equipped to exercise accountability, and making sure that policymakers are trained and supported in making more equitable and inclusive policies. So here are the 7 steps of an REIA. I've bolded out the ones that we have been focusing on with the city. As I mentioned, really assessing who benefits, who's burdened, and how do we identify more equitable alternatives. And so the role of enterprise has really been to do the background research, lay out what the data shows, and really outline, right, what about the QAP, how does it intersect with racial equity? So again, as you know, the QAP guides where low-income housing tax credit dollars can go. And so it therefore determines who, where, and how residents are served by low-income housing tax credit funded units, as well as which developer teams benefit from the program. So it influences a lot of different things, which then in turn influence racial equity outcomes. And so we've been doing a ton of data analysis over this summer, where we have been analyzing existing data on past allocations of the low-income housing tax credit in the city. And here is just a sample map where we overlaid that with how the city is defining opportunity areas to show underrepresentation of light tech units allocated in high opportunity areas when compared to the overall number of or percentage of Chicago tracts that are considered opportunity areas. And our next steps in this process are to be using the data analysis and these targeted questions to be engaging diverse stakeholders. So these are some of the different stakeholder groups that we are going to be doing outreach to and getting input from. And then we're going to be synthesizing what we've heard into recommendations that will then be incorporated into the next QAP for the city. So with that, I think that was it for my slides. I am happy to take questions, and thank you all for your time.
Thank you very much, Miriam. That was excellent presentation, a lot there to digest. We'll open it up to some questions, but it strikes me our next meeting, we're hoping to include some more discussion on overall land use planning, especially in response to COVID. And it seems like you've laid out a good blueprint on how to, not just do it for the housing issues that you're tackling with these groups, but a lot of that knowledge that you gain and experience could be transferable to how communities approach some of the overall planning responses after COVID. So with that, I'll open up to any questions or comments from the committee.
I have a question. Miriam, at one point in the report, you cited the WBEZ report on mortgage lending and the racial discrepancies there. And that was such a great report, but it really focused on, it didn't address the demand. So how many Black people are coming for mortgages and then not getting them. And I think that's kind of the crux of the problem. And in my work, I've seen, especially in the Austin community, huge problems with the getting a mortgage and the assessment process, and how basically they use, assessments. So you want to buy a house, you agree upon a price, but then the bank is like, no, it's not worth that because there's no, comparables in the area that would support that price. But then, of course, that's a cyclical problem because if you don't have that sale, then the next one, the next one, the next one. And it seemed a huge problem that I haven't seen anyone addressing anywhere. Not that I see everything, but.
During the next presentation I'll send you, there was a New York Times article, I think last week, about racial discrepancies or racial discrimination in assessments. So I think it's, like everything right now, we're all starting to bubble up at the same time, the documentation and kind of being able to pull it all together, because there's been a ton of research in all these different areas. You talk about demand, which has to do with, again, the impact of our housing policies and how it's impacted the intergenerational wealth of Black and Brown communities, or the lack thereof. And so you point out a really good point, and I'll look for that article and send it to you.
Thank you, I appreciate it.
Great, thank you. Any other questions? If not, that's a lot to digest. Very good. Oh, someone have another question?
It was Drew. Sorry, real quick one. Yeah, it's a complex issue and lots in the presentation, but I was going to ask, do you feel like the main crux is just trying to, well, the banking and finance piece that was just noted is important, but well outside my subject matter expertise. But from the land use and zoning standpoint, do you feel like the crux on that side of it is really just trying to create housing products that are affordable and meet people's needs in those areas of opportunity, whether that's employment or access to transportation and transit, whatever the opportunity or asset is, it's trying to get housing adjacent to those areas.
And education, yes, I think that that is a huge one. And I would say, you know, as for any of you who've been part of the assessment of fair housing, know how somewhat tedious sometimes these planning processes can feel. What I like about it is because it is going through every single aspect of the housing and land use system to really document these issues. But I think exclusionary zoning is huge, right? There's other ways beyond zoning that we restrict the types of housing that are able to be built in different places. But I think absolutely creating you know, diverse housing opportunities in areas of opportunity is one big issue that we are trying to address through both of these processes.
Great, thank you very much. If you have any other questions, I imagine Miriam, you'd be willing to answer those offline or after the meeting. So thank you very much.
Yeah. Thank you.
Well, hopefully go back to the APA Illinois Housing Policy Guide, agenda item number 6. Are we ready to do that, Angela?
Yes, I had to switch computers, but I'm here.
Great, thank you very much. Look forward to seeing you now.
So great. So I don't want to assume that everybody knows everything about the American Planning Association, so I will start with that. I am on the national board for the American Planning Association, and we have a series of policy guides that we try to produce to help.
Adam,
Can you? Okay. So we do policy guides to help our members, to help guide them. Some of the issues, particularly kind of as the last presentation shows, there are a lot of planning policies that can be political, depending on where you might work. There are planning policies that have a really bad impact on housing, and we try to provide some, I guess, research or backdrops for our members to use when they are addressing policy issues. So the Housing Policy Guide was updated in 2019, and we hadn't done one since 2016. So this is basically a guide that we then gear all of our work for the chapters in all 50 states and all of the 30 divisions now, the work that they do around housing. And so you can go to the next slide, Matt. Thank you. So essentially, these are kind of the overall things that the policy guide goes through, and it's the need for more inventory and how much we have to overcome. I don't think any of these issues are foreign to anybody on this call. There's a deficient supply of skilled workers. Any of you who work on the development side probably run into this a lot. Materials cost a lot of money, which certainly drives the cost. Depletion of developable lots, often due to land use policies. Land use regulations, as well as productivity. Next slide. So the major issues we attempted to address is overcrowding, affordability, location, and location really thinking about proximity to transit and jobs. For the first time, it was probably one of the most aggressive times of actually talking about not only just transit-oriented development, but even thinking about within suburban cores, how do you even spark the type of development to support housing and neighborhoods there as well. Accessibility, obviously, I think, Adam, you probably might have some thoughts on that. Expiring use and loss of existing inventory. There are a lot of tax credit units that are turning over and that are really at substantial risk of loss for affordability. And then sustainability, talking about really adding some sustainable features, even to affordable housing product, which gets to a whole nother bag of chips, which I deal with daily. Next slide. So our first position statement is to modernize state and local laws to ensure housing opportunities are available, accessible, and affordable to all. So there are within that probably, I don't know, kind of 6 action items that we kind of suggest within that. Excuse me. And it kind of goes into more detail, but they're really kind of just real blanket statements. But within that, it really kind of talks about different things, inclusionary zoning certainly being one, dismantling exclusionary zoning, which is still very prevalent in a lot of places. My first job out of graduate school was in Seattle, was working for King County, dealing with a lot of exclusionary zoning laws that were in some of the suburban areas in Seattle. There's also a lot of support of expanding efforts to create mixed income, mixed use type developments and really kind of increasing density. There are a lot of areas, it's hard to imagine living in this area, but coming from somewhere like Seattle that wasn't very dense until pretty recently, there was a lot of work that needs to be done on some of the zoning codes to really increase density for not only creating more units, but also creating more affordable units. In this particular section, we talk a lot about that, how this can be done, but in listening to the last presentation, I think about all the things we need to do more of, and kind of how we might need to revisit some of this, because this was again done in 2019, adopted in 2019, but mostly written 2016 and 17. So there's been quite a few things that have changed. But one of the bigger things is actually addressing dismantling exclusionary zoning, because for a lot of our members, they uphold policies that still do that. So that was one of our biggest thoughts. And then really supporting enabling design and design features such as tiny homes, accessory dwelling units, all of those things that people here have been a little bit on the forefront of doing, but in some of the other states, not as much. The next slide. So position 2 is preserve existing housing to maintain quality and overall supply of affordable housing. And this really aims to address market rate affordable, deed restricted affordable, and monitoring affordability and housing for older adults. One of the things that is a big push within the American Planning Association and with our partners at AARP is aging in place and what that looks like, starting to address how that can happen within the existing concept of how cities have developed. One of the big pulls out of this one is supporting more public education on home ownership, maintenance and repair. A lot of our older housing stock is in pretty, well, even I'm looking outside of my window and I see plenty of older housing stock that is in pretty bad shape, as well as providing funding opportunities to help develop that. Many communities nationwide have successfully used inclusionary zoning to ensure that a specified % of new market rate units are developed for rent or for sale income restricted units, trying to just encourage that a little bit more consistently throughout the country. And lastly, really thinking about ways we can preserve existing affordable housing stock, be it through historic designations if needed, and allocating city funds to support that. And the next one. So this is position 3. It's encourage environmental sustainability and resiliency as a critical element to housing availability and affordability. One of the things that is recommended here is to encourage net zero. And as someone who's just working on a net zero affordable project, we were not able to finance it quite, so we have net zero ready. So one day maybe we will have a chicken dinner sale or something to get the rest of the money, but financing that was not really a possibility. But we wanted to make sure that we put those words in this policy guide so it could be on the minds of people as they're looking at their housing plans and developers particularly, because I as someone who does not work in that space, I can't say that would have been on my list. So expanding just beyond LEED goals, but to real energy efficiency and water efficiency. So it's probably one of the first times within APA that we had a merging of kind of the more sustainability piece and the core housing. A big push of this is to create housing to be in walkable, transit-rich areas to support lower carbon emission choices, as well as designing housing away from flood-prone areas, which basically means New Orleans, where I went to graduate school, would never be developed, but that's neither here nor there. But really trying to discourage housing development in disaster-prone areas, which that ship has sailed from a lot of places, but within new development possibilities, keeping that in mind, as well as just really to those cities and jurisdictions that have design standards, just incorporating in environmental sustainability into those design standards. And then position 4, which is the next slide, is ensuring the public and private finance keeps pace with the innovations to support increased housing availability and affordability. This really aims to address public financing and policies on the federal level, private financing and policies, as well as innovating financing tools and improving federal coordination of programs and improvements to local tax policies. This is going to be probably one of the bigger ones post-COVID, because there's obviously going to be some tax implications to a lot of the changes in how a lot of municipalities receive funds. But just this section really goes into both low-income housing tax credits and supporting that, as well as if any of you read it, you can tell the public housing person wrote the one that really talks about the rental assistance demonstration program and recapitalization of a lot of the public housing funds. So we talk a considerable amount of that, but really the goal of this is to really kind of give our members some guidelines on what we should be advocating for, both locally and federally, to support the development of affordable housing. And then our last position statement is to support funding and program flexibility to services, shelters, and permanent supportive housing for homeless individuals and families. These actions really direct planners to advocate for funding and resources to support those most in need. We often have, for those planners who specifically work in housing, it's probably something they do regularly, but so many planners are so far removed from that. Just wanted to make sure that within a policy guide about housing, we indicated the vulnerability of the homeless populations that are often not necessarily forgotten, but necessarily planned for either. So we want to make sure we included that. This policy guide went in tandem with our equity policy guide, which also addressed some of the housing things, but that's where the ones that kind of addressed more housing and more of the fair housing as it goes to race and equity, that went into that policy guide. So that's kind of a quick overview. Essentially, this lives on our website. It goes for all of the chapters and the divisions. So for the last 2 years, Planning Home has been a high focus for the American Planning Association. Our September policy conference generally always has a heavy housing focus just because it's on policy and the federal plans in terms of CDBG, but for the last 2 years has heavily focused on housing, which, as someone who's a planner by degree, but a housing developer by day, it has helped APA be a little bit more relevant to me personally. And within Planning Home, most chapters and divisions have done a lot more webinars and sessions at conferences to really talk about how do we meet the housing need in a growing country and start really looking at density. And I mean, we've got like 2 or 3 cities that are looking at eliminating single family zoning. So that's kind of where we are with that. If anybody has any questions.
This is Lisa. I'll ask a question.
Yes.
Okay. Hey, Angela. I don't know if you all saw what I just put in the chat box. There was an interesting article in the Sun Times a couple of days ago. And I just thought it was interesting, since this committee had a discussion about McKinley Park at our previous meeting, that there's a affordable housing project that's been proposed for a historic building in the National Register District that Landmarks, Illinois got designated. And so obviously what we intended with that National Register District is working, which is that a developer was going to go in and use the building with historic tax credits and affordable housing tax credits combined. And now the Department of Housing is denying their portion of funding to the project, even though they've had conversations with the developers for months, because of an asphalt manufacturing site nearby. Commissioner Navarro has basically said she thinks it's a health issue. So this is really interesting, because obviously we don't want to see people in affordable housing be more victimized by bad environmental problems than anyone else. Obviously what happened in Little Village was a big wake-up call with the demolition that really was environmentally very bad for that community. But at the same time, this is a project that, you know, was approved, and even though the community fought it, and now the community wants this affordable housing project, and now it's being denied. So I'm not sure if this is a situation of different departments not talking to each other. I mean, maybe it was one administration decision versus another, but Angela or anyone on this call, I don't know if you're aware of this project, or CMAP staff that has been involved with McKinley Park, but I kind of feel like this is an opportunity for both CMAP and APA Illinois to weigh in on this particular dilemma in McKinley Park. Again, especially since it's a community we've been focused on.
I am not personally familiar with that project, but I think in general, we will run into this a lot, particularly as you start talking about preserving existing affordable housing, just because for many decades, that's where it was put. It was put in environmentally contaminated or close to non-desirable sources. So it's going to be a balancing job. You know, I think that'll be a nationwide thing. Our policy guide is really beyond just Illinois. It's national, but certainly I imagine I'll have to ask the equity officer for APA Illinois, who actually lives in McKinley Park. I'll have to ask her if they're getting engaged in that for sure.
Yeah, I don't remember. Dominic, is whoever is dealing with McKinley Park from CMAP staff on this call? I can't remember who gave that presentation.
Yeah, I am not personally involved in McKinley Park right now. I believe that was Enrique, wasn't it, Matt? And Enrique was, I believe, the project manager for that.
Okay, well, maybe Enrique could look at this and give us some insight, because to me, this is exactly the type of issue that, you know, I don't know if we've ever done this before, Mark, as a committee, and maybe it doesn't work that way, where a committee ever, you know, gives an opinion on a particular project, or if it has to, that's not possible because it has to pass the board of CMAP. But all the same, it'd be nice to see staff weigh in on an issue like this, just because of CMAP's commitment to McKinley Park.
Yeah, well, I mean, it certainly highlights I think one of the benefits of having the land use and housing committees combined, because you have you know, and I'm not deeply familiar with that particular site, but just looking at the photo from the Sun-Times article, and my knowledge of batch asphalt plants is somewhat of a non-permanent use. Much of that equipment can be relocated. But, you know, in those conflicts where you have an existing environmental detrimental land use, you know, in the long-term planning, what's best for that, for a community in terms of having those land uses relocated to take advantage of other assets that exist in the community. That's a long-range planning thing as well. So I think that'll be one of the benefits of having these two committees working together, is to see the interplay between land use decisions that are non-housing related and how that may have an impact on future development or redevelopment. Great. Thank you very much, Angela, for that presentation. Do we have any other questions? Otherwise, we have a couple of member updates. Okay, why don't we, stay right on schedule here, and we'll move on to member updates. I want to thank Matthew for the time that he spent talking to members of our committee to get updates on how things are going with us all, and then recommending some of those folks share with the committee their experiences. So Matthew, I'll let you take it from here and introduce our 2 member updates.
Thanks, Mark. Yeah, as in the July meeting, just with this remote meeting environment, it seems like a effective way of doing the member update section of our agenda, which has traditionally been a part of our agendas, is to sort of give people a little bit of time to prepare and bring stuff to the meeting that has been pre-identified. So for future meetings going forward, we will continue to make outbound calls for things like this, but also if there's ever an update that you feel like is right to bring to the committee, please let me or Dominic know in the future. I would like to hand it off to Ben Fenton from IDA to give an update if he is on the call.
Yes, I am still here. Thanks for the introduction. I hope you guys can hear me. I'm calling in. So, but yeah, as part of the $3.5 billion CARES Act funds awarded to Illinois in March, the Illinois General Assembly directed about almost $400 million to IDA in May to provide direct assistance to struggling renters and homeowners impacted by COVID. So on August 10th, we rolled out our emergency rental assistance program, which supports Illinois tenants unable to pay their rent due to COVID-19 related loss of income. So eligible tenants whose applications are approved will receive a one-time grant of about $5,000 paid directly to their landlord to cover missed rent payments. And those payments are beginning in March 2020, and any prepaid payments through December 2020, or until that $5,000 amount is exhausted, so whichever one comes first. The applications were intended to be open between August 10th and August 21st, but Governor Pritzker granted a one-week extension due to the recent storms that resulted in power outages throughout the state. So the application round was actually extended and ended last Friday. So I don't have the total amount of applications for you guys today that we received due to that extension, but as of August 21st, I know we had over 5,000 applications, and we expect around 30,000 tenants to receive funding. So there's a clear need and demand for this type of assistance. And on August 24th, we unveiled our emergency mortgage assistance program, which assists homeowners impacted by COVID, specifically those who've lost income or whose lost income has resulted in past due mortgage balances. And that also dates back to March. Approved applicants will receive about $15,000 paid directly to their mortgage servicer, and assistance will cover the homeowner's past due or forbearance balance and their regular mortgage payments through the end of the year, or until that $15,000 amount is exhausted. So we are accepting mortgage assistance applications until September 4th, so that program is still open. We expect to assist about 10,000 households, but similar to the rental assistance program, we expect to receive a significantly higher amount of applications than we can provide assistance for. There's just a lot of need out there right now. So some important kind of notes, we've partnered with over 60 community organizations throughout the state to market the program and expand the outreach. And a portion of the funding for each of those 2 programs is set aside for disproportionately impacted areas known as DIAs. These are high poverty zip codes that are also experiencing high COVID-19 positive cases. And also another portion of the assistance is going to areas that did not receive direct CARES funds. So these are areas that are outside Cook, Lake, DuPage, Will, Kane, and Chicago. So in the coming weeks, we're going to be awarding the applicants and working to get the money out the door to help those in need. There's a bit of urgency, specifically with the rental assistance, but hopefully by next meeting, we'll have more information on on the approved applicants and also some measurements on the program's impact. But so far, just based on the applications that have come in, there's definitely a real need for both the mortgage and the rental assistance in the state. And if any folks have any questions, feel free to ask.
Great, thank you for that update. We certainly hope we'll be successful in keeping people housed to get through this pandemic. So thank you. I look forward to the updates. Do we have any questions from committee members? Okay, hearing none. Matt, if you want to introduce our next update.
Yeah, the next update is from Bob Tucker and Wendell Harris, I believe, from the Chicago Community Loan Fund.
Great, thanks, Matt. Yeah, Matt. Yeah, I'm on the phone. I got bumped off. My Wi-Fi went out. Comcast going to Comcast. So I'm Bob Tucker. I'm the COO of the Chicago Community Loan Fund, and CCLF is almost a 30-year-old now CDFI that serves Chicagoland, and we try to deliver affordable and flexible capital and technical assistance into low and moderate income neighborhoods or lend on projects that benefit low income individuals. 30 years ago, we started as an organization. There was some research that was done, and it was determined that there were gaps in lending for co-ops and social enterprises in the Chicagoland area. So that's how CCLF actually got formed originally, to work in those areas. And when the co-op space is really worker-owned co-ops, housing co-ops, as well as food co-ops, and then social enterprises. But jump ahead 30 years later, we're now over $100 million fund, and you don't do that in Chicagoland by just doing co-ops and social enterprises. Our main asset classes now are affordable housing, community facilities, and CRE. We are a unique CDFI, not just in Chicagoland, but across the nation, because first, we are a Black-led organization. I think many of you know our president, Calvin Holmes, and I have an 8-person management team, and I'm the only white guy on that team. So we offer a unique perspective, I think, when it comes to lending and helping create deals in our community, trying to really bring a racial equity lens to the work after all these years, and investing in these long disinvested communities of color. Now, obviously, it's a very popular topic, but CCLF has been talking this language for almost 30 years. You might be familiar with some of our larger projects that we've been involved with, like the Hatchery or Excess Tennis or Englewood Square or the Stony Island Arts Bank. Sometimes we're the only lender on those deals, and sometimes we're a gap filler. We actually believe that the gap filling function is where we can really help deliver projects in communities that otherwise just couldn't launch. So that's what we're all about normally in our day-to-day work. But in these exceptional times, I saw a coffee mug the other day that said, "I can't wait for precedented times." We've stepped up and done a lot of other things that are a little bit outside our wheelhouse, but still very committed to our mission. And Wendell Harris is on. Wendell is our Vice President of Lending, and he's going to talk about some of that.
Sure. Again, thank you all for giving us a few moments just to discuss some updates on CCLF's end. Just carrying the torch that Bob talked about with the uniqueness, considering what we have recently went through with, I think most importantly, the civil unrest, which is an age-old problem, as well as COVID-19, we've started to step into a different role that CCLF really has not functioned in the past, but we are in very unique times, to say the least. So with that said, we stepped in to be a grant administrator for two different programs. The city of Chicago's Together Now, which to date we have administered about 1.78 million in grant dollars, which equated to about 411 applications for infrastructure as well as operational grants. From the state's perspective, we supported them in an administrative role as well via their DCEO program, where we to date have approved about just over $10 million, which equated to about 956 apps. To say the least, we have a team, one of our leads, to be honest, Susanna Soriana, who used to reside with the city, has been really leading the two charges here. On a loan administration standpoint, we've also helped the city, and we're continuing to help the city in an ongoing function with the City of Chicago Small Business Resiliency Fund as well, which we're really starting to pick up steam there, in addition to the Cook County's program with their relief fund, which has started to pick up as well. So suffice it to say, again, I think not only us, some of our other partners as well, Axion, IFF, LISC, we all have, decided to step into some of the needed supportive roles that our people most importantly need in our communities. And I think that's it on our end, Bob, unless you have something else.
No, that's all I had, Wendell. Thanks. Certainly happy to take any questions, though, Matt.
Great, thank you both for that update. Does anybody have any questions? Okay, before we move on to other business, we did have some people join after our initial roll call vote of the minutes. So if you joined after we did a roll call vote for approval of the minutes, if you could identify yourself for Matt so he can make sure that you're counted in the attendance today.
Okay, sure. Good morning. This is Arnold Randall.
Good morning. Thanks for joining us. Good to have you.
Sure. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. This is Veronica Gonzalez.
Great. Good morning.
Good morning, everyone. This is Sylvia Parham.
Great. Good to have you this morning. Anyone else?
Yeah, this is Alex Rao.
Great. Good morning, Alex.
Morning.
All right, thanks, Mark. I think we're good.
Okay, great. We will move on to, do we have any other business this morning? Okay.
None from CMAP, but yeah.
Oh, go ahead.
No, none from CMAP, but I would just invite anything from any other members if they had anything.
Okay, hearing none, our next meeting will be Tuesday, October 6th from 9:30 to 11:30. We do expect this to be remote again, and will be about 90 minutes, give or take. This meeting was housing focused, definitely a lot of great information. And I think it even pointed out more the need for connecting overall land uses and mobility issues with housing. The next meeting, we hope to have an agenda leaning towards the land use portion and focusing on COVID's impact on future planning. I think that's probably on a lot of our minds as we have this extended grappling with the COVID issues. And then we also would welcome any thoughts or ideas that you may want to put in for the agenda, or if you have a member update that you'd like to suggest to Matt, we'd definitely be open to that. With that, we'll move on to public comment. Do we have anybody on the line or on WebEx that would like to make a public comment this morning? Okay, hearing none, we thank you everyone for coming. I can take a motion to adjourn. Do we need a roll call vote for adjournment, or can we? No, thank you. All right, can I have a motion to adjourn?
So move.
Thank you, Nancy.
Second.
Second by Lisa. All in favor, you can just unmute and say aye.
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 Thank you very much, everyone, for joining us, and we'll see you next month. And meantime, stay safe and healthy and well. Thank you.